Welcome, boys and girls. Costin here with a discussion about Alberic de Bordelot for Bretonnia. And I think this is actually the single best Bretonian campaign in the game at the moment, given how Bretonnia works as it currently is. Sure, you could argue over Pons, Lu and Leoncoeur, the Fey Enchantress, but I think when you really stack everything up, Alberic ends up being the very best. He has a very easy opponent to deal with, but that opponent actually gives him a significant level of power and capability in his campaign, because it is a 4-region province, and having a 4-region starting province as Bretonnia is ridiculously damn good. Why is it so ridiculously good? Well, it's pretty damn simple. Bretonnia has a significant level of growth in their initial settlements. So when you're taking over settlements as Bretonnia, as Alberic, you're creating kind of dynamic in your campaign where you end up having a huge level growth, which means that Bretonnia's high-end units that you normally struggle to acquire in every other campaign, except for Ponce, but even then she has some problems. But in every other campaign, the high-end units that you struggle to recruit are far more readily available. Besides, you start with your 2 livery, which gives you access to both a paladin, and you start with 1, and knights errant. And you can also start acquiring a Grail Chapel, which will give you a Damsel. Honestly, I think it would be just better if he started with the Damsel, and maybe one of those would be acquired later. You do also have a questing vow that you can unlock. So you start as a knight, but you unlock a questing vow. So this is an idea for how Bretonnia could function as a race. Start as a knight, unless you're playing Lewin, and then start unlocking things as you go. So for instance, instead of spending all of your early game research points on getting Confederation of factions that are going to get wiped out, you spend it on getting things that are actually important. And Confederation could work better. But first, before we talk about ideas about further about how ideas of how Bretonnia should work, I think we need to talk about what Alberic does very well, beyond the growth that I just mentioned, and the fact he has those higher end units. He also has a siege battle right here. That is something of an issue for Bretonnia, especially with his starting army, but it's like Alberic does not give a single damn bloody fuck about it. He has a lot of money, he has a lot of capability, he will win that battle, that's not a problem. As I said, easy opponent. Furthermore, when you think of the enemies he deals with over here, be it the Vampire Coast, or even Marcus Wolfhard, or even Skulltaker, he's actually very well positioned in order to deal with that. And positioning a Legendary Lord so that the foes they deal with in the short term is actually something that makes a longer campaign better, because having natural foes that are both a challenge, Skulltaker is certainly one, but ones that you're equipped to deal with is what defines a good campaign. Furthermore, due to the vow system, as well as specifically the questing vow, you end up having a situation where you just naturally, due to the jungle environment, end up winning siege battles, dealing with getting the questing vow, which further unlocks things for lords. So this is why the dynamics in Alberic's campaign do end up working very well. On top of that, he also gets +2 recruit rank for all Bretonian knight units, local recruitment duration, -1 turn for Bretonian knight units, income from ports, and he's immune to high seas and reef storm attrition. Furthermore, he gets more campaign movement range, and he also has sea-based attacks for his army. Maybe it would be something for him to have it on a faction-wide level, not just a lord level. Like having both on a lord level and a faction-wide level, so if you confederate them as a legendary lord, you get that benefit for him. But make it unique if Creative Assembly is looking to rework anything specifically for him on that. And really, while the positioning works right now, it isn't a great position given the overall context of the game. So Alberic should be a naval-focused faction, but with regular settlements. Maybe he should have a horde army attached to himself, but a horde army that works based on chivalry points being spent on it, as opposed to, or zealotry. There's some mods that do zealotry, you know, add it as a resource to do unique Bretonnian upgrades, like Radius does that. Maybe you could use fanaticism, zealotry in order to decide, okay, I have these points I gain from winning battles, I can spend them to upgrade my knights and thus get a better army, or I can spend them in order to do unchivalrous actions. Or you can just spend chivalry. That's an idea for a rework. idea. But yeah, Alberic should have a naval focus campaign with a lot of benefits regards that. Remember that one of his campaign objectives is actually to deal with, uh, is actually to, or one of his missions, his objective is actually for one of his missions for the Trident is, I believe it's for him to deal with, not the quest battle for the braid over there. It's to deal to sack Sartosa. So he should not start here. As beneficial as things currently are for him, he should start maybe over somewhere around here, or maybe right in the middle of the sea against RNS. I don't know. There are different starting positions. It depends on whether or not Creative Assembly changes the map in the end times. Starting positions maybe should stay the same as they currently are if they ever do a Bretonnian rework, but with end times DLC, if they change up the map, they should change starting positions. But please remove the Sartosa sacking requirement for a quest item when your objective is to head west and deal with the jungle situation, not head east and waste your time. That's the problem. There's nothing around Sartosa that's actually worth him engaging in. Even the ports, and while he does have a lot of benefits to the ports, or maybe he could start in the Border Princes and Scrag could start in Lustria. Like, what's the point in Scrag starting in Lustria, in the Border Princes, when Alberic would be a fantastic lord to have a campaign that starts there? Because it would give you access to sea, it would give you a really good starting location that would fit very well within Bretonnia's situation. You would have access to greenskins. So, yeah, I would swap those positions out personally. Now, let's talk a bit about his skill line. So he does have special royal hippogriff, or a special hippogriff mount available to him. That's really good. But on top of that, he gets construction cost and construction time for ports, which is very useful. He gets construction cost for resource production, for resource buildings, and tradable resources. He also gets better commandment. So Alberic is the ultimate crusader lord in a lot of ways, because peasants' duty giving you additional growth, control, and additional income ends up being pretty damn great. And because of the natural growth you have, he and Rapans would be natural allies, especially if he started in Scrank's position. Like, imagine a campaign. You're playing as Alberic. You start over here, right? Like, roughly around here with the capital. Scrag switches position with Alberic. You start with maybe a tier 2 capital, just tier 2 capital for the knights, or maybe you do start with the tier 3 minor settlement. Literally, you could start with Scrag settlement as a minor tier 3 settlement. And then you get to decide, do I go after greenskins? Do I go after, do I go east? Do I get south? Not the mountains, though maybe you should help the dwarves. That's the thing about a questing knight, because that's what Alberic really is. He's a questing knight. He's not a knight of the realm. He starts as one, but he's really on a quest. And that's something worth pointing out. A questing knight system, like the way a campaign could work, is instead of having each lord and hero having their own individual questing knight, an actual vow system should be faction-wide. So you have a choice as a faction. Like, do you go for, like, you would start with knight vows, so those would be, defeat some initial enemies. Then you would have questing vows, which would be go on a quest, a more difficult opponent, not inconvenient, something natural, but something that you would have to go a bit of your way for. But not something that's unrewarding, but something rather that's very rewarding and unlocks the questing vow for every single lord of your faction. And then Grail vow would be defeat a significant threat. And then you keep doing Grail vows and Knight vows and all that. Like, you could still get them. Think of the Norska missions, just with less scripted missions and more natural dynamics. If you want the system, Legendary Grudges from Dwarves are a great system. The contracts the Maneater has could be another system. We could also talk about an errantry faction as opposed to the current errantry war system. So kind of like a Greenskin Crusade system, but rather better, right? Something tangible, something we're fighting for, something that fits the realities of the game better than what than what currently works. Again, Alberic works well with the game as is. That doesn't mean if the Bretonnia gets reworked, he would still be really good. I think he does represent the potential of Bretonnia as it is as a race. Like, when they get those units, when they use that growth, when they have vows unlocked. That's why his current campaign works as is. But Lustria is a pretty bad location for any particular campaign, especially for a faction that's supposed to be about roaming the sea. So that's the downside with Alberic right now. He works really well for what he has. Bretonnia and Lustria are still fundamentally broken. The jungle warfare aspect of Warhammer 3 does really let it down. Now, as for Bretonnia's rework as a whole, I've done a whole video on that. I'll link it in the description. I recommend you check it out. But I think, like, if there's any lesson for Creative Assembly, it would be based on how this campaign works out in the best of times, not the worst of times, because it has its own glitches and bugs and issues. All campaigns do. But when the potential is met, that is how you get a really good campaign. Not an easy one, but one where you have to actually invest and play long-term or play short-term, because you don't have to play long-term. And speaking about the Confederation aspect, because you don't really care too much about Bretonnia, since you know that the minor factions are going to get wiped out and you only want Couronne and Carcassonne, you can wait with that and finally get the later on in your campaign, and that would be brilliant. Get a lot of chivalry, change the Confederation system for it, but yeah, get Carcassonne, Leuven, maybe just a better Confederation system on the basis of errantry wars. So that's what errantry wars would do. They would be like a grudge system, but just for Bretonnia. Something to aim for, strive for, and once you reach enough points, you can confederate other factions. And which faction you decide to confederate could really shift the dynamic of your campaign by a very substantial amount. Like if you confederate Rapunzel, maybe you get her climate, but on top of that, you would also have specific objectives based on who you confederate, because Rapunzel is on a crusade war against the undead, for instance. So if you confederate her, you're assuming that you're going to be having to fight the undead, or you at least get missions in order for Rapunzel herself to really become better. And you can choose to ignore them, but if you do those missions, then Rapunzel ends up being better. That's really the key, I think, to Bretonnia. Essentially, Creative Assembly, for all the screw-ups of all the things they've done over the years, they did one thing well with Bretonnia that indicates there's at least some people in the company that have some idea of where things should go. And it's campaigns that play in the similar dynamic as Alberic, but even better, improved from what Alberic has, that are the key for how campaigns should be done in Warhammer 3. Costin here, signing out. Stay tuned for more.